Last night, Fed Chair Jerome Powell had an interview on 60 Minutes. He usually doesn't have interviews on 60 Minutes, so it's interesting to see what he was going to say. And honestly, he said some interesting things. A lot of what he was saying is usually what he says on the normal Federal Reserve press conference he has. He said that although inflation is still high and we have more room to go, however, he is seeing progress, but he wants to see even more evidence of progress before cutting rates. He said that it doesn't look likely that the Fed will cut rates in March, which is kind of reiterating what he said at the Federal Reserve press conference last Wednesday. He also said that it looks that when he was asked about the fiscal policy situation, Federal Reserve chairs normally don't get involved in fiscal policy. They view that as separate. However, when he was asked about the nation's debt, which is about $34 trillion, he said in the long run, that debt isn't really on a sustainable path. That's really all he said, and that's pretty much true, but he didn't make it seem like it's a short-term issue right now. He honestly even admitted that the Federal Reserve was late to respond to the high inflation we saw in 2021. The Federal Reserve thought that inflation was more transitory than it ended up being. And Jerome Powell was more humble than I would have thought, and he even admitted that if they had to do it again, maybe, and knowing what they know now, maybe they would have lowered rates back in 2021 earlier. And then he was obviously asked about politics, since this is an election year, if there's any pressure in terms of perhaps cutting rates in an election year. And honestly, he said that something very important and said something about his integrity. And that integrity shows that, yes, the Federal Reserve is a separate institution from the federal government. And that integrity is pretty important to note that I don't think the Federal Reserve will necessarily get involved in political pressure to cut rates before an election. But overall, Jerome Powell's interview, I thought, was pretty good. Nothing really too new, but there was it was honestly a little bit more dovish, in my opinion. And the last thing I also wanted to say is that he said that it doesn't seem like the Federal Reserve will even have to cut rates once inflation hits 2%. That there's a decent probability if the Fed cuts in May or June, as long as it's on the path toward 2%, it seems that the Federal Reserve will likely cut rates then. It's good to see that. It's not like he's not waiting to ultimately get to that 2% level. It looks like he wants to act a little bit proactively and not reactively, which was the mistake that happened in 2021 by being a little bit more reactive to the inflation we saw. So if the Federal Reserve cuts rates before inflation hits that 2% level, I think that would be beneficial and a good idea. But overall, I thought it was a pretty good interview on 60 Minutes.